Hello, you are on Ruslan Belov's channel. On air is the daily operational briefing on combat operations on the Ukrainian front. So friends, over the past 24 hours, an extremely serious advance has been recorded in the area of responsibility of the Vostok grouping, primarily in the vicinity of the city of Huliaipole. This is exactly the direction we will now focus on and analyze in detail. But first, I would like to briefly touch on the situation in Mirnohrad. Fierce fighting continues there inside the formed encirclement. A video has appeared online showing Ukrainian armed forces fighters attempting to break out of the encirclement. How it ended, you have probably already seen. Bodies, bodies, and bodies again. A truly horrifying picture. Essentially, this is the result, the very price that Ukrainian servicemen are paying for yet another decision to turn a settlement into another fortress at Zelensky's whim. Now let us move on to Huliaipole. Here, as I said at the very beginning, a truly large-scale success has been recorded. If we assess the army's advance along a north to south line, we are talking about a sector roughly 14 kilometers wide. Do you grasp the scale? And it is not only the advance itself that matters, but also its strategic significance. Just yesterday in the broadcast, we discussed that units advancing from the direction of Marfapil managed to enter the eastern part of Huliaipole, advance by about 1 kilometer, and entrench themselves in the eastern districts of the city. Over the past day, however, the situation has developed far more seriously. The fighters have fully taken control of the entire right bank part of Huliaipole. As can be clearly seen on the map, the city is divided by the Huliaipole River into two parts: the left bank, which is the main one, and the right bank. Everything located on the right bank is currently under Russian control. This amounts to roughly 12 streets and several lanes. Of course, the main and heaviest fighting for the city still lies ahead, since the left bank part of Huliaipole is essentially its core. At present, Russian forces control approximately 15 to 17% of the city's territory. Accordingly, the remaining 83 to 85% is still held by the Ukrainian armed forces. This includes areas with multi-story residential buildings, the city center, where the factory, administrative buildings, and dense residential quarters are located. However, this sector is not particularly large, and if it falls, then essentially all of Huliaipole will, in the near future, also be lost for the Ukrainian side. But over the past day, another extremely important event took place. The last village on the northern approaches to the city was taken. We are talking about Zaporizhzhia, which has come under Russian control. This is a village stretched for about 5 kilometers along the Huliaipole River, located beyond Dobropilya and representing the last settlement before Huliaipole itself. Moreover, I have precise and fully verified information that Russian fighters have already crossed the Huliaipole at several points. That is, the Ukrainian defense line here has been breached in multiple places, as I reported yesterday. More than that, they did not merely cross the river, but also managed to secure positions on the western bank. This means that in the very near future, we should expect the start of fighting for such settlements as Pryluki, Yeleno-Konstantinivka, and Zelina. And most importantly, the possibility opens up of entering Huliaipole from the northern direction. In this situation, the Ukrainian armed forces garrison finds itself pressed not merely from two sides, but effectively from three. This is because inside Huliaipole itself, Russian units have also crossed the Huliaipole River, and combat operations are already underway in the left bank part of the city. In particular, as I reported to you in the previous broadcast, I have reliable information that fighting is taking place on Myra Street. That is, Russian fighters are already on the immediate approaches to the center of Huliaipole. At the same time, my forecast remains unchanged. There is not much time left until the end of the month, just over 2 weeks, and it is unlikely that the Russian army will fully finish off the city within this period. Most likely, we are talking about a time frame of January to February. However, we all know very well that the Vostok grouping is capable of surprising, so nothing can be ruled out. If in the coming days it is possible to make a sharp push and cut the Orikhiv-Huliaipole highway, and this is the last road along which the Ukrainian armed forces can still somehow supply their garrison in the city, then the situation for the Ukrainian side will begin to collapse rapidly. In that case, as already happened in Siversk, the Ukrainian armed forces will simply be unable to hold their positions, and the city will fairly quickly come under Russian control. At the same time, it is important to understand that in this sector of the front, the key factor is not even the capture of Huliaipole itself. Although, of course, this is where the main focus is currently concentrated, and the media space is actively being pumped with the thesis that Huliaipole is allegedly critically important. From a military point of view, however, something else is far more important. The most significant event here is the breakthrough of the Huliaipole defensive line. This may come as a surprise to some, but indeed this factor is far more important than control over the city itself. The fact is that it is precisely the Huliaipole River and the line of fortifications behind it that currently restrain the Vostok grouping from further advancing westward, deeper into Zaporizhzhia region. As I have already said, there is information from a source that does not deal in spreading fakes, and these data confirm that in 2 places the river has already been crossed and positions secured on the western bank. However, it is still too early to speak of a full and stable breakthrough of the defense line, at least in the Huliaipole area. Such a breakthrough can be stated when Russian troops reach and secure positions at least along the entire railway line in this sector. Only then can it be confidently said that the Huliaipole defensive line has been breached. It is important to note that in addition to the railway itself, there is also dominating high ground there, since the railway tracks run along elevated terrain. I will now show you the elevation map. Here, take a look. And if Russian units reach and establish themselves along this railway, then the defensive line will completely lose its meaning. Moreover, after that, the Russian army will be able to use the former Ukrainian defensive line for its own purposes. Another significant event along this same line is the capture of the first settlement beyond the Huliaipole River, namely the village of Pishana. Yes, formally it is located in Dnipropetrovsk region, but this in no way negates the fact that in several places the Ukrainian defense has already collapsed, and Russian troops are establishing firm and sustained control here. One can expect that many more interesting developments will come from this area in the near future, since judging by everything, the Ukrainian armed forces will not be able to hold back the advance of the Russian army for long, and the front may very quickly roll westward. And by the way, one more important point. After the fall of Huliaipole, and I think no one doubts that the Ukrainian armed forces will not be able to hold the city. The only question is timing, whether it happens in a couple of weeks, in a month, or in a month and a half. After the loss of Huliaipole, only 4 cities will remain under Ukrainian armed forces control in Zaporizhzhia region. These are the small town of Novomykolaiivka, with a population of about 5,000 people, located in the north. Then Orikhiv, with a pre-war population of around 18,000, where the Dnipro grouping is currently positioned and attempting to probe the Ukrainian defenses. However, as I have repeatedly said, the Russian army has been standing here for several years already, and serious progress will begin only when the Vostok grouping approaches this area, which is not a near-term prospect. Plus Vilnyansk, with a pre-war population of about 16,000 people. And finally, the city of Zaporizhzhia itself, with a pre-war population of around 700,000 people. Whether these cities will remain under Ukrainian armed forces control or not, directly depends on whether the war continues further or whether, within the next 1 to 2 months, some kind of agreement is nevertheless reached. If hostilities continue and the conflict drags on for at least another year, then I can say frankly that the Ukrainian armed forces will, at a minimum, lose Orikhiv and, quite likely, Novomykolaiivka. It is also possible that Vilnyansk will be under threat. Everything will depend on the pace of the Russian advance. Overall, within a year, it is fully realistic that the Russian army will reach Vilnyansk as well and approach Zaporizhzhia from the eastern direction. So we will closely monitor how the situation develops. Moving on. As I already told you about Mirnohrad, units of the Ukrainian armed forces continue attempts to break through the blockade and escape the encirclement, but these attempts end the same way every time, with heavy losses. In the Pokrovsk area, the Ukrainian side is trying to launch assaults from the northern direction and is getting the exact same result. Yesterday in the broadcast, I told you how a powerful assault was launched from the Shevchenko direction, during which more than 50 fighters were destroyed. Over the past 24 hours, No attacks of that scale were recorded. However, small Ukrainian groups attempted to probe the Russian defenses. The outcome was predictable. 12 Ukrainian armed forces soldiers became 200ths and remained lying in the fields. Naturally, they failed to break into Pokrovsk itself. The Sloviansk-Kramatorsk direction. In the Siversk area, Russian units, after fully establishing control over the city, continue advancing westward. The fighting has gradually shifted to the eastern outskirts of Reznikivka. This is a very elongated village, stretching for 5 to 6 kilometers, and it is one of the routes leading toward Oleksandrivka. This settlement is considered the next objective of offensive operations. The main task is to reach the watershed and approach the distant outskirts of Sloviansk. The Lyman sector. Here, with great difficulty but steadily, the Ukrainian armed forces' defenses are being gnawed through in the Dibrova area. There have been certain tactical successes in the areas of Drobyshev and Yarova. At the same time, statements that Yarova has already been fully taken by Russian troops are premature. Fighting for the settlement continues, and it has not yet been concluded. In the near future, Russian forces may begin an assault on Sviatohirsk, a small settlement located at the foot of the Sviatohirsk Lavra, and of course, Kupiansk. I know that many of you are interested in this city, but here, unfortunately, I cannot report anything fundamentally new over the past day. Neither the Russian army nor the Ukrainian armed forces have recorded any significant progress. Russian units continue to hold the Yubileyny micro-district and the central part of the right bank, and they are also repelling assaults in the northern part of the city. The situation remains the same as before. The overall situation is steadily difficult, and the risk of losing all of Kupiansk still remains. The problems are also the same, and the main one, as I have repeatedly said, is logistics. The Russian army still does not have full and stable supply on the right bank, and this is where most of the difficulties stem from. In the western part of Zaporizhzhia region, positive advances by Russian forces have also been recorded. Russian fighters have moved into the center of Primorsk, and there is also movement eastward along the M18 highway. We are currently awaiting footage of objective control from this area, as progress in this sector is of serious importance. Meanwhile, Bankova continues to deliberately escalate the situation in the so-called infrastructure war, following a path of further escalation. This means that Ukraine will soon face another wave of massive drone and missile strikes. Winter will only intensify, according to the Telegram channel Legitimnayi. And to those who ask, why are outages mainly affecting the southeast, the north, and partially the center of Ukraine right now? I can say the following. Western Ukraine will soon face the same thing. A catastrophe benefits Zelensky, one that he himself is provoking, and he has no intention of stopping. On the contrary, it is a convenient case for personal PR and profit, for laundering funds through the so-called points of invincibility. Billions will also be written off under this pretext, just as they have already been written off for the construction of protective facilities for the energy infrastructure. Well then, that is all I have for today regarding the situation on the front. Now let us look at what is happening on the political field. Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov made a statement in which he noted, "I think that the contribution of Ukrainians and Europeans to these papers is unlikely to be constructive. If corresponding amendments appear, we will have very strong objections. There is unlikely to be anything good there." Thus, the Kremlin is Zarania rejecting Zelensky's demands for elections before peace is achieved and other possible changes to key points of Donald Trump's peace plan. Moscow is essentially seeking to avoid a situation in which responsibility for the absence of a peace agreement is shifted onto it after Zelensky and European leaders voice their conditions and reservations regarding Trump's plan. At the same time, it is worth noting that Zelensky himself has already begun to gradually warm up the topic of concessions. He warned Ukrainian citizens about upcoming compromises and the practical unattainability of NATO membership. He also stated that he has not yet received an official response from the United States to his new proposals regarding the peace plan. The issue of Ukraine's accession to NATO remains unrealistic, and therefore a compromise in the form of bilateral security guarantees is now being discussed. The Prime Minister of Hungary, in turn, stated that the confiscation of frozen Russian assets amounts to a declaration of war. By bypassing Hungary, destroying European law in broad daylight on an open street, they are encroaching on Russian property. This is a declaration of war. Touching frozen Russian property and appropriating it is a declaration of war. I have never seen the seizure of 200 to 300 billion euros from any country not provoke retaliatory steps. That simply does not happen, Viktor Orban stated. The Kremlin also responded to alarming statements by the NATO Secretary General, who called on Europe to prepare for a possible large-scale armed conflict. These words were commented on by Dmitry Peskov. Rutte simply does not understand what he is talking about, the Russian presidential press secretary said in an interview with VGTRK journalist Pavel Zarubin. According to Peskov, such rhetoric is characteristic of people who have lost a living connection with the tragic experience of the Second World War. He recalled that Rutte grew up and lived in the Netherlands, where, according to his personal observations, historical memory of the war is often reduced to everyday hardships rather than an understanding of the true scale of the catastrophe. Peskov noted that in a number of European countries there is a lack of deep understanding of what war really is, and it is precisely this, in his view, that explains the sharpness and irresponsibility of such statements. He emphasized that in Russian society, the attitude toward history and the memory of war are fundamentally different, since its consequences affected virtually every family. Earlier, Mark Rutte had stated that Europe could allegedly become Russia's next target and urged Europeans to prepare for a possible major military confrontation, appealing to the experience of their ancestors. Against this background, political analyst Fyodor Lukyanov drew attention in his Telegram channel to the biography of Rutte's father, who conducted business in colonial Indonesia and during the war was interned by Japanese authorities. The expert ironically questioned which side the ancestors of the current NATO chief fought on, recalling the complex colonial past of the Netherlands. Mark Rutte became NATO Secretary General in 2024, after more than a decade in the post of Prime Minister of the Netherlands. His harsh statements toward Russia have become part of the current pan-European debate on security. Meanwhile, the Financial Times reports that the Volkswagen Group is closing a plant in Germany for the first time in its 88-year history. On Tuesday, the German automaker is halting vehicle production at its plant in Dresden. This is the first such case in the company's entire history. The reasons include rising production costs, declining sales in China and the European Union, as well as a sharp drop in sales in the United States due to tariffs introduced by Donald Trump. The closure of the Dresden plant is a serious step by Volkswagen to reduce production capacity in Germany and is accompanied by plans to lay off around 35,000 employees in the company's German divisions. In turn, Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš has also stated that the Czech Republic cannot serve as a guarantor of financing for Ukraine, and that the European Commission should look for other options. At the same time, the Czech Republic supports Hungary's position in its confrontation with the European Union. We must bring Europe back, not from outsiders, but from insiders. Europe is not Brussels, he emphasized. He